Retired sheriff who lived alone for years started talking to 10 Apache women. Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The wind cut across the scrubland in low, steady gusts, dragging dry dust and brittle tufts of grass across the flat earth. Southeastern Arizona, spring of 1885. The high desert stretched for miles in every direction, burnt ochre, sun-hardened, and quiet. The kind of place where nothing moved unless it needed to. And lately not much had. Elijah Boone stood on the worn porch of his cabin, a battered coffee mug cooling in his hand. His frame was still broad despite the years, 63, give or take, depending on which calendar you believed. He wore the same clothes nearly every day, wool trousers, suspenders, a gray shirt fraying at the cuffs. A Colt Navy revolver still hung on his hip, though he hadn't fired it in months. Maybe years. His beard was more white than gray now, short and coarse. The brim of his hat shaded deep lines under his eyes that had once watched saloon doors and courthouse steps, but now mostly watched the dirt and the sky. He lived alone by choice. After retiring from the sheriff's post in Bisbee, Elijah moved deeper into the territory where no one came unless they were lost, running, or didn't care about being found. His wife had passed 10 winters ago, cancer or something like it. They never gave it a name. No children, no kin left he knew of. Just him, a weather-worn cabin, a lean-to barn, and a few goats that didn't need much tending. That morning, he noticed movement by the south ridge, far off, barely more than shadows shifting between two cottonwoods near the old dry creek. He stared for a long time before lowering the mug and stepping inside. He didn't panic, just moved slow, took the Henry rifle from above the mantel and loaded it calmly. Years of instinct didn't go away just because the badge had come off. He walked back out onto the porch, leaned against the post, and waited. Within the hour, the figures came into view. 10 of them, all women. Apache by the look of their clothing, buckskin worn to threads, shawls, dust-covered faces. Some older, some barely more than girls. Their pace was steady, quiet, organized. None of them carried weapons openly. One of them walked ahead of the others. A woman, late 30s maybe, with dark hair tied at her nape and shoulders squared like someone used to leading. She didn't wave. She didn't shout. She stopped 30 feet from the porch and waited. Elijah's voice hadn't been used much lately, but it came out steady. This is private land. She didn't flinch, just not at once. We're not staying. Just need water. Her voice was calm, neither desperate nor demanding. That unsettled him more than if she'd begged. He looked past her, scanned the others. No sign of hidden men. No flanking. Just tired, hungry people who didn't want trouble. He lowered the rifle slightly. Not completely. Creek's dry. Got a pump round back. If you need it, use it. Then move on. The woman glanced back at the group. One of the younger girls was swaying where she stood, lips cracked from sun exposure. Another held a baby, swaddled in rough cloth, still as stone. "We won't steal," the woman said. "Won't cause harm." Elijah studied her. Her face was drawn from travel, but her eyes were sharp, watchful. He recognized the type. She'd seen hardship, probably led people through worse. He thought about what his wife would have said, about how easy it was to look away when people needed help. "You got a name?" he asked. "Nalina." He nodded. "You can pump water. You can rest your feet. But don't crowd the house." Nalina gave no thanks, just motioned the group forward. The women passed him like shadows, silent, slow, cautious. He could see they were thin. One limped. One was missing fingers on her left hand. None of them looked like they expected kindness, just hoped for less harm than the last place. He watched as they circled to the back of the cabin, found the pump, and began taking turns. The water sputtered and flowed, and he heard the low sound of someone crying. Not loud, not broken, just relief. Still, he kept the rifle close. Inside, he stood near the window, watching from behind the curtain. He didn't understand yet why they'd come through this stretch of land, this far from any trail, any fort. He didn't know if someone was chasing them or if the land had just run out ahead of them. What he did know was that they didn't look like they'd make it another week without help. He thought about turning them away, knew he still could, But he also remembered the year the fever came through Bisbee, when the only nurse had been an Apache woman, and how she'd stayed even when folks spat at her feet. By nightfall, the women had gathered near the barn. Not one tried to come to the house. They made a fire from broken limbs and dry grass. Nalina sat with her back to the wind, shielding the youngest girl beside her. Elijah locked the door, bolted it, but he didn't sleep much. His world had been silent for years. That night, for the first time in a long while, he heard the sound of other people breathing, and he wasn't sure yet what that meant. The next morning came without sound, just light, pale, and stretched thin across the hills like someone laying a cloth over the land. Elijah Boone stepped out onto the porch as he always did, rifle slung loosely in his grip, jaw clenched against the morning chill. But this time, there were 10 figures curled in the shadow of his barn, quiet and unmoving, smoke rising faintly from their fire. He watched for a long moment. Nothing had been stolen. The goats were still penned. The pump wasn't broken. His tools were untouched. A small detail, but it told him something. These women weren't thieves, weren't squatters looking to take advantage. They had just run out of places. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching over the dry soil, and walked toward them. Eyes met his as he approached, cautious, unreadable. Only one of them stood as he neared, Nalina. She moved slowly, no sudden gestures, her expression flat but firm. She didn't speak first. She let him decide if there was going to be any talking. "You plan to keep moving today?" he asked. "We have nowhere to move to," she answered. He looked past her. The women were still gaunt, still half-starved. One of the younger ones had a cough now, dry and hacking. The one holding the baby had fallen asleep, sitting up. No one looked like they had the strength to travel. He chewed the inside of his cheek. "This land's not meant for surviving. Summer comes fast. We know. Then you know it'll get worse. No water out past the ridge. No shelter. No army patrols either. Just scrub and heat." "We're not waiting for the army," Nalina said. There was no anger in her tone, just finality, a statement of fact. Elijah squinted toward the horizon. "You all come from the San Carlos agency?" "Yes." "Why leave it?" Nalina hesitated for the first time. He saw her weigh the answer. When it came, it was short. "Because staying would have killed us." That was all she said, and it was all she needed to say. Elijah nodded slowly and motioned with his chin. "Barn's dry inside. Floor's solid. You can sleep there instead of dirt. But you split wood, carry water, and clean up your mess. I don't run a church." She didn't thank him. She just nodded once, then turned and quietly gave instructions to the others. He watched them stand, stretch stiff limbs, and begin moving without complaint. 2 of the older women immediately started sweeping the barn out. Another began folding up the blanket rolls. The girl with the cough took a bucket and walked, unsteady but willing, toward the pump. He turned and walked back to the cabin, pausing at the door. He glanced back once more. They worked like people who didn't expect to be told twice. That mattered to him. Inside, he lit the stove, boiled beans, and stood staring at them while they bubbled. He didn't like guests. Hadn't had any in years. Even passing riders didn't stop anymore. But something about the quiet efficiency of those women stuck in his head. He poured the pot into a tin basin and walked it out to the barn, set it down by the door without a word. Before he turned to leave, he caught Nalina's eye. She gave the faintest nod. Not quite thanks, not quite recognition. Just enough. That afternoon, Elijah began to notice details. One woman, maybe 40, had a twisted ankle. Another, much older, only had vision in one eye. The youngest looked no older than 13. They didn't ask him for anything. Not food, not help. They stayed out of his way. But they also didn't leave. By sunset, the barn smelled of cedar shavings and clean dust. The women had hung old blankets over the open slats to cut the wind. Someone had found broken wagon boards and leaned them up as a barrier. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safer than open ground. As night fell, Elijah sat on his porch again, pipe in hand but unlit. He thought about the question that hadn't left him all day. Why these women? Why now? And why here? He remembered his time as sheriff. He'd seen resettlement orders, forced marches, sicknesses that tore through camps. None of it was written down the way it actually happened. San Carlos, Fort Apache, all the places the army put people and called it order. He'd seen the corners they cut and the promises they broke. It wasn't hard to imagine what staying would have killed us really meant. But Elijah also knew this land had no kindness in it. You either dug your way into survival or died quiet in the dust. He wasn't in the business of saving anyone anymore. He wasn't sure he ever had been. And yet, he hadn't turned them away. Inside, he sat by the fire and listened. Through the thin walls, he could hear them softly speaking in their language, not loud, not laughing, but steady, like a stream running through a canyon you couldn't see. He didn't understand a word, but he realized he didn't feel as alone as he had just 2 days ago. He poured himself another mug of coffee and stayed up well past midnight, the rifle resting across his lap. Because for the first time in years, someone else was sleeping under his roof, even if it wasn't the house. And that meant watching mattered again. The third morning broke with a pale sun, stretching shadows across the yard as Elijah Boone walked out of the cabin with his hat low and a battered tin cup of black coffee in hand. He paused near the porch rail, gaze fixed on the barn. Smoke was rising again from their small fire pit, thin, controlled. The women were already moving. One of the older women had dug a trench behind the barn during the night. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to manage waste. He hadn't told them to do it. No one had asked. He didn't miss that detail. He respected it. Two others were hauling firewood from the split stack he'd left near the fence. They didn't take all of it, only what they needed. They left the kindling in place, didn't touch the heavier rounds. That, too, meant something. Elijah didn't know their names yet. He hadn't asked, but he'd started remembering their faces. How they moved, who limped, who didn't speak at all. He knew Nalina's name, and it was her he saw now, walking slowly toward the pump with 2 buckets balanced in her grip. Her gait was steady, but her eyes were tired. He met her halfway. "You been sleeping?" he asked. "Enough," he grunted. "You'll break your back if you keep hauling water like that. We all do what we must." He didn't press, just took one of the buckets from her hand without asking and walked beside her in silence. When they reached the barn, he set it down and stepped back. "You staying longer than a day or two?" he asked. Nalina didn't answer right away. She studied his face, looking for judgment maybe, or a trap in his tone. There wasn't one. "We won't stay forever, but we don't have anywhere to go yet." What happened at San Carlos? Some of the men turned violent. The army let them, called it a tribal dispute, and walked away. She paused. "We weren't safe. We left at night." He watched her face as she spoke. No anger, just resignation and exhaustion. It made sense now. Why only women? Why some looked wounded? Why none had spoken of husbands or brothers? They'd been left behind, or chosen to leave what couldn't be fixed. "You got family out there?" he asked, nodding toward the hills. "No one who would take us in." He scratched the edge of his jaw. "You planning on just waiting out the desert?" "No. We'll earn our keep if we stay." He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. By midday, the youngest girl, barely a teenager, had begun coughing blood. Elijah found her leaning against the barn, hand clutched to her ribs, eyes dazed. He crouched beside her. "She sick long?" he asked. Nalina nodded. 3 weeks. Started after the last rains. Fever, then cough. She won't let us take her to a town. She afraid of being turned in." "Yes." He stood, pulled the bandana from his neck, and handed it to the girl without a word. She took it with shaking hands. Her name, he learned later, was Cully. She was 16. That afternoon, Elijah saddled his mule and rode out alone, 10 miles north to an old Mexican trader he hadn't spoken to in a year. He came back with dried beans, white cornmeal, old linen strips for bandaging, and a small satchel of quinine. He didn't tell the women where he got it or why he thought to bring it. He just dropped it beside the fire pit and walked back to the cabin. That evening, one of the women, older, square-faced, hard-knuckled, approached his porch and placed a bundle at his feet. Inside were 2 clean quail and a pouch of dried berries. Payment, he assumed. Or thanks. He didn't open the door, just waited until she walked away before picking it up. The sun dipped low. Coyotes barked in the distance. Elijah sat by the fire inside and stared into the coals. For the first time in years, he was letting people near, people he didn't know, didn't fully trust, and who had every reason not to trust him. He thought about Nalina's face. Not soft, not harsh, just steady, like stone warmed by the sun. He didn't want a cause. He didn't want redemption. But something about these women, how they moved without complaint, how they didn't ask for sympathy, how they'd survived things he couldn't name, kept him from closing the door again. There was still no formal agreement, no plan, no future laid out. But the barn was full. The water pump was working. The fire burned low. And Elijah Boone didn't feel quite as retired anymore. By the fourth week, Elijah Boone knew their names. Not all of them at once. Not by asking. He listened. He observed. He learned them through moments. A soft call across the barnyard. The way they answered one another. The rhythm of shared tasks. There was Yiska, the woman with the bad ankle who sat with Cully when her coughing grew worse. Naiz, who sang quietly when she thought no one could hear. Hania, older than the rest, who stitched the torn lining of Elijah's coat without asking, then left it folded neatly on the porch rail one morning. Nalina remained the center without trying to be. She didn't issue orders. She didn't raise her voice. But when she stood, others stood. When she moved, others followed. She never lingered by the house, never crossed the invisible line between barn and porch unless she had reason. It was as if she understood that Elijah still needed space, even while everything else about his life was shifting. He had started leaving tools out during the day. An axe, a shovel, buckets, rope. They used them and returned them. Always clean, never damaged. One afternoon, Elijah came back from riding fence and found the fence fixed. Not the whole line, just a portion where a few posts had fallen during winter. Reset, tamped, the wire retied. He didn't ask who did it. The work was clean. That was answer enough. That same evening, as he carried a sack of feed to the goat pen, he heard footsteps behind him, soft, steady, deliberate. He didn't turn right away, just said, "You need something?" It was Nalina. "There's a man watching us," she said. He turned then, sharply. Her face was calm, but her hands were clenched. "Where?" "Ridge. North side. Just before sundown. Not close. But still." He had a horse. Didn't move. "You sure he wasn't a rancher?" He watched, then left when I stood. Elijah didn't ask how she could tell. He believed her. That night, he cleaned the Henry rifle slow and quiet on the porch. His movements were practiced, methodical. He hadn't fired at anything human in years, but his hands hadn't forgotten. Inside, he checked the revolver and laid it near the cot. The next morning, he rode out early and scanned the northern rise. No sign of boot tracks, just hoof prints, faint, recent. He didn't mention it to the women. Not yet. But that night, he moved a cot into the barn. Told them it was for Cully, so she wouldn't have to lie on the cold floor anymore. No one questioned it. But when he returned to the cabin, he found a strip of smoked venison and a single feather, red and black, left on the porch rail. A wordless acknowledgement. Still, Elijah needed answers. That evening, he approached Nalina where she sat cleaning an old copper pot beside the barn. "That man you saw, could he been following you since San Carlos?" "I don't know. Anyone you left behind who might want you found?" Her eyes tightened. "Some of us had men. Some of them didn't agree with leaving. Some were angry we didn't take their side. So they'd chase you across 2 counties? If they lost power by us leaving, yes." He took that in silent. The fire snapped beside them. "How many?" "There were 12 of us when we left," she said. "Now we're 10. He didn't ask what happened to the other 2. Later that night, Elijah spread his old survey maps across the table. He traced the trails north, east, then west. Thought about who might have noticed 10 women crossing open land. Thought about who'd want them brought back. He didn't like the answers. But the bigger question had started taking root in his mind. Not who they ran from, but what would happen when they were no longer running. Would they stay? He had no plans. No family. No real life left that could be disrupted. But what he saw now, mending fence without being asked, tending the sick, cleaning the land, they weren't burdens. They were making something here, even if they didn't realize it yet. The next morning, Elijah set up a second water trough near the barn, hauled the pipe himself, rebuilt the support post. He didn't ask permission. Later that day, Yiska brought him a strip of cloth wrapped around herbs, Something for the pain in his back, she said. She didn't speak English well. She didn't need to, and by evening, Cully's coughing had softened. Not gone, but not as harsh. The land hadn't changed. The sun still beat down. The wind still tore through the high ridges. But inside the perimeter of his property, just inside, something had started to settle. Elijah Boone wasn't a lawman anymore, wasn't a savior, but he was no longer alone, and that mattered. The following week opened with heavy skies. Not storming, just the kind of gray that pressed down on the land like a warning. Elijah noticed it first thing that morning when he stepped out to check the fence line again. The air had gone still. Even the birds stayed low. In the barnyard, the Apache women had risen early. Nalina and two others were grinding mesquite pods into meal using smooth stones. Cully sat wrapped in an old wool blanket, her face pale but no longer sunken. She hadn't coughed through the night. Elijah had listened for it from his cot more than once and noticed the absence. Yiska stood near the barn doorway, sharpening a blade with quiet focus. Her eyes flicked toward the horizon now and again, watchful. By now, the routines had formed. Elijah didn't issue instructions, and they didn't wait for them. They kept the barn clean, fed his goats, even started a small plot near the north fence where Nalina said they could grow beans if there was any rain at all this season. But despite the rhythm of the days, the man on the ridge had not been forgotten. Elijah had seen more hoof tracks 2 mornings ago, fresh, this time circling in from the east and veering off again before reaching the cabin. Not military, not ranchers. No mail route passed through here. Someone was watching. He didn't tell the women yet. He needed to understand who it was before he stirred panic. But that didn't mean he stood idle. He rode out farther now, checking the outer boundaries of his land twice a day. In the evenings, he reinforced the barn latches and moved the goats to the smaller pen closer to the house. That afternoon, while hammering fresh nails into the porch rail, Elijah finally asked the question that had sat with him for days. You had 12 when you left. You said now there's 10. Nalina stood nearby, winding twine around bundles of dried herbs. She didn't look up. One turn back, she said simply. She didn't believe we'd survive. She had family on the agency. Thought she'd be safer with them. And the other? Her husband followed us. He caught up near Apache Pass. She tried to talk him down. What happened? He didn't come to talk. And she didn't run. Elijah exhaled through his nose. No more questions came after that. That night, over a low fire behind the barn, he finally sat down with them. Not as an outsider, not as someone watching from a distance, but close enough to share the warmth. They didn't treat it as a gesture. Didn't thank him. Nalina simply shifted slightly to give him room. The women spoke softly among themselves in their language, and he didn't try to follow. He just listened, and in that silence, he felt more human than he had in years. At one point, Nais handed him a bundle of roasted pinyon nuts, wrapped in cloth. He accepted it with a nod and took a few into his palm, chewing slowly. The taste was sharp, earthy, grounding. Then came a question from Cully. She spoke softly, her voice still weak, but the words were clear. Why did you stay here, all alone? The others went quiet. Elijah looked up, caught off guard. Not because the question was rude, but because no one had asked him anything personal in a long, long time. He rubbed the back of his neck, stared into the fire for a moment. My wife passed. Years back. We didn't have children. I left town, quit the badge. Came here. Didn't want company after that. Cully looked at him, eyes calm. Did it help? He gave the faintest shake of his head. Not really, but made the silence easier. No one said anything more, but the women stayed a little longer by the fire that night. And so did he. The next morning, he made a decision. Elijah rode out to the trading post again, farther this time, picked up sacks of flour, salt, tin plates, fabric, and a few small items the women might find useful, combs, sewing needles, soap. He loaded it all in silence and returned just after sundown. He left the supplies in the barn without saying a word. The next day, he found his cabin windows cleaned, the porch swept, and his boots, usually left by the door, freshly oiled. This wasn't charity anymore. It was community. What no one had spoken aloud, but each of them understood in the quiet tasks and shared work, was that they weren't just surviving here. They were beginning something that didn't need a name yet, but had already taken root. The heat came early that year. By the time June rolled across the high ridges of southeastern Arizona, the wind had turned dry and metallic. The ground cracked in wide veins across the pasture, and every footstep kicked up a little more dust than the day before. Elijah Boone rose before first light, as always. The cabin was already warm, and the water in the pitcher had gone flat overnight. He splashed it across his face anyway, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the growing heat. The women were already at work. Yiska and Naiz were hauling stones from the creek, building up a small wall to shade the new bean sprouts they'd coaxed into life along the north fence. Nalina stood near the pump, watching the horizon, her expression unreadable. Elijah noticed she did that more often now, looking out, waiting, not nervously, just aware. A leader who never really let her guard down. He stepped off the porch and approached. "How long can you keep them working in this heat?" "As long as it takes," she said, "but we'll shift the work before midday. Shade, then firewood. Nothing heavy." He nodded. "Good." Then he said something he hadn't planned. "I saw that rider again." She turned her head, but didn't speak. This time he came closer, down by the dead mesquite. Watched for a while, then rode west. Same man, can't be sure, but same horse. Dark gray, lame on the back right. Nalina's mouth tightened. She took that in slowly. "If it's who I think, he won't come alone next time." Elijah looked out across the land. "How many?" "Could be 4, maybe 5. They're not soldiers. Just men. Apache, but not ours. Drunk on power, stripped from it when we left. They want obedience, not company." He exhaled, ran a hand along his jaw. "You think they'll come here?" She didn't answer right away. "They followed us this far. They know we survived. That's enough of a reason." He studied her a moment. "Then we prepare." He didn't ask her to leave. Didn't tell her they had to run again. Something between them had already settled into a quiet agreement. This was ground they would not give up. That afternoon, Elijah walked the perimeter with a Henry rifle strapped to his back. He marked out points with lines of stone, places the women could fall back to if trouble came. He reinforced the barn's doors, added an interior latch made from scrap iron. He stacked firewood close to the porch and kept the mule saddled. That evening, as the sun bled into the mountains, he finally shared the truth with all of them. Around the fire, 10 pairs of eyes watched him as he stood with arms crossed, words slow but direct. "There's a man, maybe more, tracking your trail. He hasn't approached, but he's close. If he comes here, I'll stand with you. But if you want to leave, I won't stop you." None of them moved. None of them spoke over one another. It was Hania, the oldest, who answered first. "We ran long enough." Naiz nodded beside her. "If we leave again, we'll be chased again." Nalina simply said, "We stay." That night, Elijah didn't sleep. Neither did Nalina. She took watch on the barn roof, while he sat on the porch with the rifle laid across his lap. At one point, in the deep silence between midnight and dawn, she came down and stood beside him. No words, just presence. After a while, he spoke low. "I thought I came out here to bury the noise of the world. Truth is, I just wanted to disappear." "You didn't," she said softly. He turned to look at her, but she didn't meet his eyes. "You stayed." The next few days passed without incident. The rider didn't return, but the tension didn't leave. Elijah continued preparing. More food stores, hidden water skins near the well, extra rounds wrapped in cloth and tucked near the porch stairs. He didn't do it out of fear. He did it because life had taught him that silence usually came before trouble. He also began training the women, quietly, subtly. Showed them how to hold a rifle, how to keep the barrel clean, how to load without wasting rounds. He didn't treat them like children. He didn't assume they hadn't seen violence. He just gave them tools they hadn't been allowed to use. By the end of the week, Naiz could reload in under 10 seconds. Yiska could hit a tin can from 20 yards with Elijah's old revolver. He noticed the way Nalina watched him during those moments. Not with gratitude, not with suspicion, with something heavier. Respect, maybe, or understanding. One afternoon, while sharpening a blade on the porch step, he finally said it aloud. "You planning to build something permanent here?" She was kneeling nearby, repairing a torn saddlebag. Her hands didn't stop moving. "If the land lets us." He nodded slowly. "It will." And he meant it. because for the first time in a long time, this land had something to protect again. And so did he. The sun came up fast that morning. No mist, no clouds, no delay. Just heat pouring over the ridge like it had been waiting all night. Elijah Boone was already outside, sleeves rolled up, sweat working through the back of his shirt before breakfast. He'd barely touched the coffee when Naiz came running from the barn, her braids swinging behind her, breath tight in her chest. They came, she said. Elijah didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He grabbed the Henry from beside the door and followed her. On the far ridge, just past the dead mesquite where the land broke in a low scrub, 5 riders sat mounted and still. Apache men, all of them, lean, armed and waiting. Nalina stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, expression like stone. The rest of the women stayed close to the barn, eyes trained but not afraid. The rifles Elijah had shown them to use were already in place, 3 resting on crates behind the water trough, 1 tucked beneath the porch, and another near the barn door. He walked up beside Nalina. They're not charging in, he said. No, she replied. They want to speak first. Show strength. He watched the riders a moment longer. The lead one shifted in the saddle. A younger man, bare-chested, hair tied in a thick knot, a repeating rifle slung across his back. You know him? Elijah asked. Nalina nodded once. His name is Delson. My husband's cousin. He part of what you ran from? Yes. Elijah adjusted his grip on the rifle. You want me to talk to them? No, she said. They came for me. I'll handle it. He didn't argue, but he didn't walk away either. She stepped forward calm and slow. As she crossed the field, Delson dismounted, walked a few paces from the others, and waited. They met in the middle, neither raising their voices. Elijah watched every twitch of Delson's hands, every shift in his stance. They spoke in Apache, but tone carried meaning. Delson pointed once toward the barn, toward the women. His voice raised. Nalina didn't flinch. She shook her head. Firm. Final. He stepped in closer, too close, but she didn't back away. Just stared straight through him. Then he said something that made her shoulders go stiff. Elijah's hand moved to the rifle's stock. But Nalina didn't reach for a weapon. She just lifted her chin and said one word. Loud. Final. Whatever it was, it stopped him cold. Delson stood there, face tight, jaw clenched. Then he spat in the dirt at her feet, turned, and walked back to his horse. None of the 5 riders looked back as they disappeared over the ridge. When Nalina returned, Elijah met her halfway. She didn't speak at first. He didn't press. Finally, she said, he offered to take me back. Said the others could be forgiven if I did. What did you tell him? That we're not going back. He nodded once. You believe he'll stay away? No. He's humiliated now. That's dangerous. The next few days passed in heavy silence. No attacks came, but the pressure hung in the air like a thunderhead refusing to break. Elijah spent most of the time checking supplies, securing fences, tightening locks. The women carried on, not out of denial, but because they'd lived with worse. Cooley was strong enough now to help with meals. Hania stitched fresh canvas covers for the water troughs. Yiska watched the ridge at dusk. One night, as Elijah sat on the porch, Nalina stepped out of the barn and walked to the edge of the field. She stood there for a long time. He joined her without speaking. Finally, she said, You've been watching over us, even before you admitted it. I don't sleep easy anymore, he replied. You don't talk much either. That never helped me much in the past. She looked at him then. Really looked. Why did you let us stay? He exhaled slowly. Because you never asked for pity. You just started living. That meant something. The fire crackled in the barnyard behind them. Somewhere a coyote called, but distant. She said quietly, You've changed. So have you. Neither smiled, but both stayed outside longer than they needed to. In the morning, Elijah found something new near the barn. A tall post, sunk deep in the earth, with Apache carvings etched into the side. He didn't ask what it meant, but the base had stones around it, deliberate like it was meant to last. Later, Nalina explained it without being asked. It marks a place where we decided to stay, not hide. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Then we'll protect it, because this was no longer temporary. This was becoming home. It had been nearly 2 months since the women arrived. The high summer sun scorched the land now, and the air was dry enough to crack lips and split old boards. But something had shifted on Elijah Boone's property. Something rooted, held firm. The small patch of beans behind the barn was holding strong, shielded by rock walls and soaked with water hauled by hand. The goats were fattening. The barn had been reinforced with fresh timber, cut and carried by 3 women working with silent coordination. And every morning, before sunrise, Elijah walked the edges of the land while Naiz tracked quietly beside him, noting any changes in soil, tracks, or air. The 5 riders had not returned. Not yet. But Elijah knew better than to mistake quiet for safety. That kind of threat didn't just vanish. It waited, circled, looked for cracks. Which is why he kept building. Not walls. Systems. Contingencies. He begun digging a shallow root cellar behind the cabin. Just deep enough to store dried goods, ammunition, anything that needed hiding. Yiska helped him reinforce the roof with salvaged wagon beams. While they worked, she asked him what no one else had. "You ever shoot anyone since coming here?" Elijah didn't look up. "No, not even threats. Nothing made it to my front door." She nodded. "You will." He paused, then met her eyes. "I hope not." By the end of the week, Cully, now walking with energy and color back at her face, brought in 6 rabbits snared along the southern fence line. Naiz had taught her the knots, the tracking, the baiting. Cully had learned fast. Elijah watched her skin and gut them with sure hands. She didn't smile often, but she had started humming again, almost unconsciously. It was the sound of someone who no longer feared the next day. Later that evening, as the light bled out behind the ridgeline, Elijah finally told Nalina what he'd kept quiet. "There's a man west of here. Works out of 3 wells. Name's Doyleang." She glanced up from the fire. "He's a scout. Mercenary type. Knows the old agency system. Used to run with some of the army trackers before they pulled back. He's dangerous because he's patient. You think he's tied to Delsin? I think Delson's pride is bruised. And a man like Doyle is the kind you hire when you want to find someone who doesn't want to be found." Nalina processed that without reaction. "I don't want to bring blood to your land," she said. "You didn't," Elijah answered. "Not yet." He leaned forward. "If they come here, it's not just about you anymore. You understand that." "I do." He saw something shift behind her eyes. A weight she'd kept buried. Fear, maybe, but not for herself. That night, Elijah didn't sleep indoors. He rolled his bedding out on the porch with the rifle beside him. He watched the dark, listened to the wind, waited for something to move, and when nothing did, he still didn't relax. 2 days later, a small group of traders arrived from the south. 2 wagons for men and a young boy. Friendly enough. They stayed back from the barn and addressed Elijah with care. Asked if he'd be willing to trade cured meat for salt and nails. The women stayed inside, unseen but not fearful. Elijah made the trade, cautious but fair. One of the men, a thin-faced freighter with sunburned skin and a sour smell, stared too long toward the barn, but said nothing. When they left, Elijah saddled the mule and rode the opposite direction for an hour. He doubled back, unseen, and watched their trail. No signs of doubling back. No extra riders. Just traders. Still, when he returned, he told Nalina to keep everyone close that night. The sense of looming threat hadn't left him since the day Delsin spit in the dirt. That evening, as they all sat around the fire, Naiz asked Elijah something unexpected. "Why don't you leave?" He glanced up. "You have no blood here. No obligation. You could pack your mule and be gone in the dark. No one would blame you." He looked around. The fire, the faces, the barn they'd made solid, the land that, somehow, now had a pulse to it. He said, "Because I've seen what happens to people when no one stays." Naiz held his gaze, then nodded. Nalina didn't speak, but she sat beside him a little closer that night. Later, when the others had gone to sleep, she remained. "You said once you came here to disappear." "I did." "You haven't." "No," he said, "I haven't." She looked at him then, the firelight tracing the lines across her face. The years of burden, the cost of decisions, the quiet strength of someone who didn't break even when the ground kept shifting under her feet. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you." They said nothing more. But when she rose to leave, her hand brushed lightly across his shoulder. It was not a declaration, not a promise, just a moment. But it held everything the silence could not. And it stayed with him long after the fire died. It began with silence, not the natural kind, the hush that rolls in before dawn or hangs above a canyon, but something unnatural held too long, like a breath before bad news. Elijah Boone felt it in his bones before he saw anything. That morning, the wind didn't move. The birds didn't call. Even the goats shifted uneasily in their pen. He saddled the mule before the sun fully rose, not saying a word to the women, though he knew Nalina was already watching him from the barn doorway. She said nothing either. She didn't have to. The last few weeks had sharpened their understanding of each other to the point where words weren't needed. Elijah rode north, past the fence line, toward the ridge where Delson had last been seen. The land there was flat and exposed. No trees, just scrub and the faint path of an old cattle trail long and used. He stopped at the dead mesquite, dismounted, and scanned the terrain with a sharp eye honed by decades. Tracks. Not fresh, but not old either. 3 horses, maybe 4. The pattern told him they'd circled, stopped, circled again. Watching, measuring distance, perhaps. Timing. He followed them for half a mile before turning back. Not because he was done, because it was enough to confirm what had been building quietly under the surface. They were coming. When he returned, Nalina was waiting on the porch. He dismounted slowly, dust caking his boots. "They're close," she said. "Closer than before. They've been scouting from the canyon ridge. Not random. What now? We finish what we started." That day, Elijah and the women worked without pause. Fences were reinforced. Water barrels were filled and rolled into shaded positions. The small root cellar was stocked and covered. Tools were hidden under loose planks. Nais and Yiska spent hours sharpening blades and counting rounds. Elijah taught Cully how to use a second rifle, short barrel, single shot, better suited to someone small. She didn't flinch when she held it. By nightfall, the land looked calm, but everything that mattered had changed. They didn't eat together that evening. They kept to their tasks, their thoughts. But no one packed. No one ran. That Elijah thought said everything. Just before midnight, Elijah sat on the porch again, the rifle across his lap. Nalina approached quietly, sat beside him. The firelight behind them flickered low. "You can still walk away," she said. "They're coming for us, not for you." He didn't answer right away. He studied the dark hills. "I had a brother once," he said quietly. "Long time ago. Ran off during the war. I was 15. He came back in pieces 2 years later. After that, I stayed angry for a long time. Thought if I didn't care about anyone, nothing else could be taken." He shifted, glanced at her. Didn't work. She didn't respond with words. Just placed her hand gently over his. He didn't move. The next morning, the riders came. 5 men, all Apache, armed and unsmiling. They appeared just after sunrise on the ridge and made no effort to hide. Elijah stood in the yard with his hat low and both boots planted. Nalina stood beside him. Yiska and Nais flanked the barn. Cully watched from the window of the cabin, rifle propped at her shoulder. The lead rider, Delson, raised his hand and called out, "This is your last chance, Nalina. Come now, and the rest can go free." She stepped forward, past Elijah, toward the open yard. "You don't speak for us," she said, clear and steady. Delson's face tightened. "You bring shame. You lead women into dirt. We chose dirt over chains." He spat. "Then you'll die with it." He drew his rifle, but he was too slow. A shot cracked from the porch, Elijah's Henry. The bullet ripped the bark from the mesquite beside Delson's boot. A warning. The man flinched but didn't shoot. The standoff held. "This is my land," Elijah called. "They're under my roof now. You fire one shot, and you won't leave standing." It was the first time he had said it aloud. "Under my roof." A long pause followed. Tension wound so tight the air itself seemed thinner. Then Delson did something unexpected. He laughed, bitter and sharp. He turned his horse without another word. The others followed. No shots fired. Elijah didn't lower his rifle until they vanished from view. The barnyard was silent again, but this time it was peace, not fear. The women exhaled. Some sat down where they stood. Cully stepped outside for the first time in 2 days and dropped her shoulders. That evening, they all gathered around the fire. No speeches, no celebration, just a meal shared in silence. And the weight of survival felt equally by everyone present. Elijah sat with Nelina beside him. Her hand found his again. This time he held it. No one asked what came next, but they all knew. Whatever it was, they'd face it together. The dust settled long after the riders had disappeared from the ridge, but the shift in the air was immediate. Something had changed, not just in the ground they stood on, but in the way they stood together. Elijah Boone had spent a lifetime measuring people by what they said in moments of conflict. But what mattered more now was what no one said afterward. The next morning, Elijah stood at the north fence line with a length of fresh barbed wire and a hammer tucked into his belt. Nais joined him without a word and took the other end. Across the field, Yiska led the goats down to the trough. Cully swept the barn floor with deliberate focus. It was a normal morning, and it mattered that it was. In the cabin, Elijah had moved his cot to the far wall and laid out clean quilts. The women had begun filtering into the space more often now, not to take shelter, but to help, drying herbs in the window, stacking firewood beside the stove, leaving bowls of roasted corn on the table. What had started as caution had become routine, and routine had quietly turned into home. That evening, Nelina approached him near the garden beds, where green shoots were starting to rise in the cracked soil. She crouched beside a struggling sprout and dusted its leaves with care. "Elijah," she said quietly. He looked up from the bucket he was filling. "I think we're ready to build something permanent." He paused, then nodded. "I agree." There were no blueprints, no grand gestures, just action. Over the next week, Elijah and the women worked as one. A second shelter began to take shape near the barn. Sturdy walls framed with scavenged timber, a stone foundation laid by hand, every board nailed with deliberate care. It wasn't just shelter, it was a statement. They built a communal cooking space, expanded the bean patch, even dug a deeper well with a stronger pulley system. Hania, despite her age, carved symbols into the beams, marks of protection and peace. Yiska fashioned windbreaks from split rails and brush. Elijah, for the first time in years, felt the sun on his back not as a burden, but as purpose. The land responded, too. Rain came in mid-July. Not much, but enough to darken the soil and give the crops a fighting chance. The goats birthed 2 kids. The hens from a nearby trading post started laying. The sound of life, real, ongoing life, returned to the ridge. One morning, a letter arrived. It was carried by a government courier, a young man on a lean horse with dusty boots and cautious eyes. Elijah met him at the property edge. The man handed him the envelope, tipped his hat, and left without asking questions. The letter was from a bureau official. It stated that a group of women had been marked missing from San Carlos Agency, that sightings had been reported, that there were rumors of them occupying land without permission. Elijah read it twice. Then he folded it and tucked it under a skillet in the cabin stove. He never mentioned it to the others. Some truths didn't deserve a response. 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. The same courier returned, this time bringing not paper, but supplies. A wagon load of salt, beans, fabric, and dried fruit. The driver, a middle-aged Hispanic man named Ricardo, said it came from an anonymous donor. "No questions," Ricardo said. "Just said it was time someone helped people who were already helping themselves." Elijah nodded, signed the ledger, and left it at that. That evening, the women prepared a feast, not grand, but meaningful. Corn cakes, boiled goat meat, fresh herbs, and fire-roasted squash. They sat together on the porch and yard, the warm air humming with cicadas, the lanterns glowing in the soft dark. Cully sat closest to the fire, holding the newest goat kid in her lap. Nais hummed a tune from her childhood. Yiska sharpened a knife, but wasn't expecting to use it. Hania leaned back with her eyes closed, breathing in the smoke and evening air as though it were medicine. And beside Elijah, Nelina sat without tension, without watchfulness. Her shoulders had dropped. Her gaze was no longer pointed outward, but toward the fire, where the others laughed and shared food. Did you ever think it would look like this? She asked. He shook his head. No, but I hope. She looked over at him. You still planning to die out here alone? Doesn't seem likely anymore. She reached out then and took his hand. This time, they didn't let go. By autumn, the second shelter was complete. The root cellar was full. The ridgeline had not seen riders in nearly 2 moons. And for the first time since they'd arrived, the women no longer referred to the place as his land. They called it ours. Elijah Boone never returned to town, never took up a badge again. He didn't need to. The badge hadn't given him purpose. The people had. And in their quiet, persistent way, they had given him something no uniform ever had, a reason to stay. The past still lived in each of them, in scars, in silence, in guarded glances, but it no longer decided the shape of their days. They had chosen each other, not for survival anymore, but for life. And they stayed, together, until the end.